happened to my dad when he was little. I think it bothered him a little emotionally, but he never admitted it. The story scares me, just imagining it. So I'm sure my dad was 10 years old at the time, and for whatever reason he was home alone. He was watching TV in the living room. It was the only TV in the house, and suddenly the TV turned off, so he got up and turned it back on. It was an old crappy TV, so when he got back to his couch it wasn't strange at all. He got up again and turned the TV on, and it turned off again. He repeated this process a few more times before he started looking for the remote. While looking for the remote, he went behind a couch and saw a man hiding in the corner. Holding the TV remote, my dad described the man as having long messy hair and a crazy look in his eyes. He gave my dad a smile, and my dad ran out the door screaming like a little girl. He went to his neighbors, who called the police. When the police got there, the man was still in the house. So he was arrested. My father told me that he still assumed the man was homeless or crazy. Whatever the case, this story is absolutely terrifying. My friend told me about an incident that happened to him when he was about 8 or 9 years old. He was walking home from school, and his single mother took out her keys to let herself into the house where she worked. When she returned home later on a weekday, she reached out to put the key in the door. His mother had been sick, and instead of greeting him, she opened the door in her dressing gown. She looked straight past my friend and said, "Who are you?" My friend turned around, and a man in a long coat was walking quickly down the street. Being sick that day probably saved his daughter from something potentially terrible happening to her. Before I start this story, I want to note that Jacob's mother was a drug addict, and his father really didn't have much wrong with him other than being with his mother. So one night, while Jacob and his father were asleep, they heard loud banging, scratching, and moving noises coming from their mother's room. Jacob's father jumped out of bed and ran into the hall and started banging on the door. His mother opened the door. She yelled at him to be quiet, and he woke her up. She asked him what noise he hadn't heard. Jacob's father assumed she was doing something again, but something was wrong. The window was open, and the TV was turned around on the other side of the room, still plugged in and the screen facing out. Jacob's father was quite scared. He closed the window, locked his bed, locked his mother's room from the outside, and put him to sleep in the living room. He was awake most nights, waking Jacob at 5. Jacob went to the kitchen where his mother was already. A few minutes later, his father walked in with wide eyes. He pointed at Jacob and his mother and held his finger to his lips. They both remained silent. They heard something rustling on the roof. Jacob's father had a bat. They sat quietly in the room together. A few minutes later, the noise went away. Jacob's grandmother was called. She was asked if everyone could stay there for a while. She said yes and told them she would come to get them. Jacob finished eating and went to sit on the sofa. There was no TV in that room, so he sat quietly. He looked at the door of an empty room in the corridor. The door was open, with a finger wrapped around it. Jacob shouted and pointed, and his father grabbed him and ran out. Jacob's mother followed. They went to a petrol pump and sat in front until they saw Jacob's grandmother's truck. Jacob described how unusual the finger looked to me. He said it reminded him a bit of foam. The finger was clearly wrapped around the door frame in length and width. The door was stuck upside down. Then he didn't go back to that room for a long time. After taking everything out, he never came back. Nothing had been stolen, and the window of the empty room, music, was open. I was 13 years old. My most isolated bedroom was unimaginable, and I often lay awake late at night, scared and frightened, unable to sleep. My bedroom was on the opposite side of my parents' room, on a different floor of the room. They couldn't hear what was going on in my room. So it was a normal night where it was raining but not storming. I woke up and looked at the clock and saw that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I suddenly had an uneasy feeling, but I didn't know why. I saw on the edge of the bed, the shadow of something round just above the edge of my bed. My heart started to beat, until I realized it was just my hat. I sometimes hung my hat on a wooden pole by the bed, so I would lie down and fall back asleep. About half an hour later, I woke up again and was startled again by the shadow at the end of the bed. But after my brain fully woke up, I remembered it was just my hat. This process happened again that night, maybe another half hour later, and I was startled again by the shadow. I felt thirsty, so I reached my hand to the side of my bed and looked for my water bottle, but I found something else instead of my hat. At that moment, my heart rate dropped to my stomach. I was trying to turn on the light when I almost fell out of bed. As I turned on the light, my heart rate dropped to the side of my stomach and a man's face appeared, looking straight into my eyes. I screamed loudly. The boy must have come out and ran straight past the man and down the stairs of my room. It felt like the man was trying to grab me. But I opened the door and ran to my parents' room to get my father. Dad took out a baton from under the bed and entered my room. But when we returned home, the window was wide open. Apparently, the man had jumped onto the balcony roof outside my window. When I was little, I had a lot of friends back then, who all lived on my block. On weekend nights, we would always play manhunt. That is, hide and seek. We would go out and look for the elderly. It worked great because we were all neighbors. We would use the front yard, even the woods behind the house. Although we had a rule that we couldn't go further than the backyard. I always used the same hiding spot and no one would find me. I always hid behind an old rusty barrel that had been thrown out in the woods years ago. So on this particular night, there were only 6 of us playing. My friends Joe and Raj were in my group. We quickly dispersed because we were the first to hide. I did my usual hiding. I went through my yard and into the woods behind the barrel. Usually I would see the other team's flashlight shining through the yard inside the woods. But this time it was unusually quiet. Then finally I heard footsteps nearby. I couldn't see the flashlight, so I assumed it was one of my teammates. I whispered Joe and Raj's names, but then whoever it was started running at me loudly. I immediately shot up and ran out of the woods and started looking for a new hiding place in my yard. But no one ever came out of the woods. I heard all my friends calling my name from up ahead, even Joe and Raj, so I assumed something was wrong and moved forward. I saw Joe's parents talking to my parents. All my friends were surrounding my parents. I was feeling a little relief to see me. So I was naturally very confused. They told me that a police officer had just passed by and warned them that a serial rapist had been seen in AA and that all the kids needed to stay indoors. I explained what happened to me in the woods and my parents were scared and 100% sure that I wasn't lying. They called the police. I don't really know if he ever got caught, but I really hope he did. I'm not trying to be like anyone who would have gotten caught when I was 12 or 13. My mom, my stepdad, and 2 dogs went to the beach for the weekend. We rented an apartment all the way back from the shore. The apartment wasn't anything special at first glance. We unpacked and went out for dinner. Then we came back and it was probably 9 p.m. We watched TV for about an hour. My mom, stepdad, and 2 dogs slept on a bed they made out of the couch. They gave me the room with a king-size bed. I went to bed and used my computer for a while. I played some games that were pre-installed, because I knew there wouldn't be an internet connection. I kept playing games at night. I decided it was time to get some sleep. After maybe 5 minutes of lying in bed, the room was completely silent, but suddenly I heard a very loud music sigh. I knew it wasn't my parents or the dogs. The living room door was closed. I walked straight out of that room and went to sleep in the bedroom opposite the master bedroom. My heart was pounding so fast I was absolutely terrified. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. I told my parents about it the next morning and they told me it was probably my imagination, but I was sure it wasn't music. This story still gives me nightmares to this day. I was staying with one of my best friends in North Carolina, where I was coming from New Jersey for a job interview. My friend Mike let me stay at his house for a few days. He didn't live very close to the company I was interviewing for, about 2 hours away, but I just wanted to see a good friend of mine again. So after the second interview, it happened. I came back to Mike's house in a good mood because I had been offered the job. That night we had fun in the yard with a few friends and a few beers. Or lots of beers. We stayed up late and basically all night long, bad people were coming. Mike didn't really keep track of who came in and out of his house. So we called it a night after everyone left around 4 a.m. struggled up the stairs to the bathroom, soaked the snake in water, and splashed my face with hot water. At that moment, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to the half-open door and saw an eye peering at me through the crack in the door. I made a loud noise. Underscore, and drunk and unsteady, I fell to the floor as I got back to my feet. The eye was gone. I stumbled out of the bathroom and called Mike's name. I heard him calling from downstairs in the kitchen. It couldn't possibly be him. I didn't hear anyone coming down the stairs, but I asked if he was upstairs, and as expected he said no. I can't quite remember, but I think I just brushed it off as I had had too much to drink. I reached the guest bedroom and fell into bed, barely able to pull the covers over myself. You know when you're drunk you fall asleep more easily. That's an understatement. I think I fell asleep within seconds of getting into bed, but woke up after an unknown amount of sleep. I immediately felt an unbearable headache and started rubbing my head. Probably just before sunrise. The room was a bit cold. My feet came out of the covers hanging over the edge of the bed. Then suddenly something very cold grabbed my feet and I started to reach for it. Then I heard a hoarse voice. It started to whisper the words, "Can you help me?" I sat up and screamed at the top of my lungs before getting out of bed and meeting Mike on the stairs. I called the police and they arrived shortly after. The intruder was actually a woman, in her late 40s, apparently. She was on drugs. She admitted that she had gone into Mike's house and hidden in a closet. Her eyes were peeking at me while I was in the bathroom. I always cover my feet with a blanket. It was winter now and some friends and I were on a skiing trip to South Lake Tahoe. We were staying in a large luxury log cabin for a few nights. On the third night, during a snowstorm, I got up to get a glass of water. As I was walking through the cabin toward the kitchen that night, there was a loud knock on the door. I was a little scared that someone was tapping on the slate. I thought maybe I should ignore it and let them go. But I realized that they knew we were there because my car was parked right outside. I also thought that maybe someone was in trouble and needed to get out of the dangerous weather. I tiptoed to the door and waited for another knock. Before long, there was another knock. This time it was louder. I asked again loudly, but there was no answer after asking this question. There was no more knocking. I was curious and opened the door. The chain lock was still on, in case no one was outside. I unlocked it and opened the door completely. The snow crunched away from the cabin. Maybe I was feeling some kind of guilt and anxiety. I put on my boots and jacket and went out to step into the storm. The footprints took me to the edge of the property before they were completely full. You are not. The footprints are not completely finished. No sign of a car, no sign of a struggle, nothing. It felt like whoever made the tracks was standing in my place. I felt annoyed and ran back to the cabin and closed the door behind me. I locked the door behind me before I could gather my thoughts. I started to knock excitedly on the door. My heart started pounding again and I started to scream for my friends. They all ran to see what had happened. When we opened the door, no one was there. The footprints were already full. I could never prove what had happened to my friends. I don't blame them for not believing me. I almost didn't believe myself, but I knew it had happened. I just couldn't even try to explain it. It still scares me to this day. My friend and I were going to a party out of town for a few hours, so we decided to stay at his family's holiday house about an hour south of the party, arriving around noon. It was winter in the holiday town, so there were no other cars on the road when we left for the party. I debated for a while whether to close the gate completely. It would have been a bit of a hassle to open it earlier when we arrived. If we were coming home late at night, I didn't want to be stuck outside. We decided to close the gate for safety. The party was great. We got home around 12:30 a.m. and the doors were open. I felt like I was in danger right away because I knew I had it locked. I knew it wouldn't blow away in the wind, but I didn't want to make a big deal. So when my friend asked me if I should turn it off, we went inside and decided to make a snack. I was walking through the house when suddenly my friend came running from the kitchen into the hallway and almost knocked me to the ground. He was sure it was someone walking outside. We tried to calm ourselves down, but we had no cell reception, and for the next half hour there was no one else around. As we sat in the hallway in fear, we heard footsteps outside and the back door was closed. We decided we had to leave, so we packed up and got ready to take a break for the car. Just as we were at the front door, there was a loud noise in the backyard and suddenly hundreds of birds started chirping. We got the car into the car, finally starting the car with all our belongings in our laps that we hadn't even bought yet, even to put in the back. As we pulled out of the driveway, we saw someone running towards us from the side of the house. We quickly drove home. I didn't sleep that night. When I was 10 years old and my little brother Ben was the only one. This weekend my parents were painting our bedroom, so we had to sleep in the basement. There was a couch that turned into a bed and Ben had an extra crib there. I was only 10 years old, so sleeping in the basement with Pete Star was very uncomfortable. Somehow being there made me feel a little safer, even though he would wake me up in the middle of the night, crying, and for some reason taking care of him made sleeping there a little less scary. But this one time I woke up and saw him screaming, not crying, like he wasn't a 1-year-old. I was immediately scared and ran over to him to see what was wrong. He was standing there looking at me and pointing at something. In the direction I was pointing was the dark boiler room right next to his crib. I felt as if 1,000 knives were stabbing me in the chest, and in the heat of the moment I vaguely remember the soft sound of something falling in the boiler room, and I felt as if I was being watched in that basement. I grabbed Ben and got out of there as quickly as I could. I never went back to that basement again. Finally, we started the car with all our stuff in our laps that we hadn't bought yet, even to put in the back. As we pulled out of the driveway, we saw someone running past the house toward us. We quickly returned home. I couldn't sleep that night. When I was 10 years old and my little brother Ben was the only one. This weekend my parents were painting our bedroom, so we had to sleep in the basement. There was a couch that turned into a bed and Ben had an extra crib there. I was only 10 years old, so sleeping in the basement with Pete Star was very uncomfortable. Somehow being there made me feel a little safer, although he would wake me up in the middle of the night, crying, and for some reason taking care of him made sleeping there a little less scary. But this one time I woke up to find him screaming, not crying, like he wasn't a 1-year-old. I was immediately scared and ran over to him to see what was wrong. He stood there looking at me and pointing at something. In the direction I was pointing was the dark boiler room right next to his cage. I felt as if 1,000 knives had stabbed me in the chest, and in the heat of the moment I vaguely remember the soft sound of something falling in the boiler room, and I felt as if I was being watched in that basement. I grabbed Ben and got out of there as quickly as I could. I never went back to that basement again. Finally, we started the car with all our stuff in our laps that we hadn't bought yet, even to put in the back. As we pulled out of the driveway, we saw someone running past the house toward us. We quickly returned home. I couldn't sleep that night. When I was 10 years old and my little brother Ben was the only one. This weekend my parents were painting our bedroom, so we had to sleep in the basement. There was a couch that turned into a bed and Ben had an extra crib there. I was only 10 years old, so sleeping in the basement with Pete Star was very uncomfortable. Somehow being there made me feel a little safer, although he would wake me up in the middle of the night, crying, and for some reason taking care of him made sleeping there a little less scary. But this one time I woke up to find him screaming, not crying, like he wasn't a 1-year-old. I was immediately scared and ran over to him to see what was wrong. He stood there looking at me and pointing at something. In the direction I was pointing was the dark boiler room right next to his cage. I felt as if 1,000 knives had stabbed me in the chest, and in the heat of the moment I vaguely remember the soft sound of something falling in the boiler room, and I felt as if I was being watched in that basement. I grabbed Ben and got out of there as quickly as I could. I never went back to that basement again.